America owes $36 trillion. Why hasn't it collapsed yet? When Americans see the government spending trillions of dollars while national debt has already surpassed $36 trillion, it is natural to feel confused. The common question arises, why does the world's largest economy carry such a massive debt? In reality, national debt is not the same as personal or household debt. The government borrows not only to spend, but also to invest in infrastructure, defense, research, and to keep the economy functioning. If managed wisely, debt can serve as a powerful tool for growth. On the other hand, if spending is reckless, it can easily turn into a burden that squeezes the budget. In my opinion, the real issue is not whether debt exists, but how it is managed. The United States has a unique advantage because the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency, allowing the country to borrow at lower interest rates than most others. However, if trust in its ability to repay declines, borrowing costs could skyrocket and put heavy pressure on the economy. The lesson here is clear. National debt is not inherently bad, but it requires transparency, discipline, and a long-term strategy. Public debt, also known as national debt, is essentially the total amount of money the federal government borrows to cover expenses that exceed its revenue. This is a debt at the national level and does not include debts from individual states such as California or Texas. It is also completely different from personal debts like credit cards, student loans, or mortgages. Understanding this distinction is crucial because confusing government debt with personal debt can lead to serious misunderstandings when evaluating the financial health of a country. In my view, the clearest way to think about it is that national debt is more like a financial tool the government uses to keep the system running and to invest in the future. People often worry when they hear figures in the tens of trillions of dollars, but in reality, the government has access to funding at much lower interest rates than individuals. What truly matters is not just the size of the debt, but whether that debt is being used effectively. If it is managed transparently and invested wisely, national debt can act as a driver of growth rather than a burden. The U.S. government borrows money for many reasons, and it is not always a negative thing. First, the budget often runs a deficit when tax revenues fall short of expenses for healthcare, education, or defense, so borrowing becomes a way to fill the gap. In addition, the government borrows to invest in development, such as building infrastructure, creating jobs, and stimulating economic growth. During times of crisis, like the COVID-19 pandemic, the U.S. had to borrow trillions of dollars to support businesses and citizens. Borrowing is also used to restructure old debt by taking on new loans to pay off previous ones, as long as it is managed responsibly. Finally, debt serves as a macroeconomic tool to help stabilize interest rates, control inflation, and maintain the strength of the U.S. dollar. In my opinion, borrowing is not inherently bad. The real issue is whether borrowed money is being directed toward boosting productivity and creating long-term value. If it is only used as a short-term fix, the burden will grow heavier. But if debt is invested in sustainable growth, it can become a key driver of national prosperity. So, who actually lends money to the United States? In reality, the funding comes from many different sources. First, there are citizens and domestic organizations. When they buy government bonds, they are essentially lending money to the government in exchange for a safe return. In addition, foreign governments and investors also play a major role. China and Japan currently hold hundreds of billions of dollars in U.S. bonds, seeing them as a secure and stable investment. International organizations such as the IMF and World Bank, while primarily lending to other countries, can also involve the U.S. in their system. And we cannot forget the Federal Reserve, which indirectly purchases bonds through commercial banks to help regulate the economy. In my opinion, this highlights a unique interdependence. The world needs the U.S. dollar as a global standard for trade and reserves, while the U.S. relies on global capital to sustain its spending and growth. It's almost like a marriage of interests, both sides benefit, but the relationship is fragile if trust begins to fade. That is why transparency and maintaining credibility are absolutely vital for America. Public debt is not entirely bad. The real issue lies in how it is used. If the government borrows to invest in infrastructure, research, or education, then that debt functions more like an investment in the future. These projects can create jobs, boost productivity, and eventually generate more tax revenue to repay the debt. On the other hand, if borrowing is only to pay off old debt, support a bloated bureaucracy, or maintain inefficient spending, then the risk of falling into a debt trap becomes very real. In such cases, debt stops being a growth tool and turns into a heavy burden on the budget. The United States enjoys a unique advantage that few nations have. The U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency. This allows America to borrow more easily and at lower costs compared to most countries. However, in my opinion, this advantage is not a permanent shield. The U.S. is far from a debt crisis like Sri Lanka, but its long-standing habit of overspending will inevitably lead to higher interest payments. Without financial discipline and transparent management, today's advantage could quickly turn into tomorrow's vulnerability. To manage public debt effectively, a country needs a clear framework of action. The first step is smart debt management, which means prioritizing borrowing for sectors that improve productivity, such as technology, clean energy, or education. These are investments that can generate long-term benefits rather than merely addressing short-term needs. The second step is cyclical budget discipline. During times of strong economic growth, the government should save and reduce borrowing. Conversely, in times of crisis, borrowing more to support the economy is reasonable. The final step is strengthening transparency and financial discipline. Reforming public spending, cutting waste, and limiting special interests not only reduce debt, but also build trust among citizens and investors. In my opinion, this framework may sound simple, but putting it into practice is a huge challenge. Politics often favors short-term goals, while debt management requires a long-term vision. If the United States takes transparency and discipline seriously, public debt can serve as a tool for sustainable growth instead of a lingering concern. Perhaps it is time for Americans to change the way they look at public debt. Instead of treating debt as the enemy, it should be seen as a financial tool. The key question is not how much does the U.S. owe, but rather what is the debt being used for and how is it managed? If directed wisely, public debt can serve as an investment in the future, building modern infrastructure, advancing technology, expanding education, and preserving America's role as a global superpower. But if debt is merely spend now, pay later, then the risk of a financial crisis becomes very real. In my opinion, public debt is like a double-edged sword. If held firmly and used with care, it can bring enormous benefits. But if handled recklessly, the consequences can be severe. The U.S. enjoys a unique advantage with the dollar as the world's reserve currency. But that advantage will not last forever without discipline. The core lesson here is simple. Debt itself is not bad. The real difference lies in vision, transparency, and responsible management. If you found this breakdown eye-opening, don't stop here. On the Fraud Files, we uncover the hidden truths behind money, power, and the financial systems shaping your life. From debt secrets to the biggest scams in history, you'll get the stories no one else dares to tell. Hit subscribe now and join thousands of curious minds learning how the world of finance really works. Don't just watch the news, understand the story behind it.